My name is Carl Valeri, host of Aviation Careers Podcast, and today we're going to talk about the good, the bad, and the illegal. What you need to know about avoiding and building flight time and things that you may or may not know about. And I'm really excited about this because this is kind of an add-on to our last episode. And today joining me again is Chris Pezalla from the law offices of Strumer Law. Hey, Chris, how you doing today?
Great, Carl. How are you doing?
I am doing wonderful. Before we get started, just a quick shout out to our sponsor. We have a new sponsor, and that's Stratus Financial. Stratus Financial is where dreams take flight. Stratus Financial offers loans to pilot training. It also understands your needs because they're pilots. You can find out more at stratus.finance. And one of the things that's great about all of our sponsors is they give away free scholarships guides. And they're giving away scholarships guides by using the coupon code Stratus. And you can find out more going to aviationcareerspodcast.com/scholarships and get your free scholarships guide by using the coupon code Stratus. You know, whether it's financing your dream of flying or simply the process by taking care of your student loans, their efficient, hassle-free funding can connect you to the life of your dreams of becoming a professional pilot sooner than you ever thought possible. To find out more, of course, visit our friends at stratus.finance. And again, if you want one of those free scholarships guides, use the coupon code Stratus. Anyway, let's move on to the show. And again, Chris, thanks so much for joining us again on this episode. We had a lot of questions we wanted to finish up in our last episode, and you can go back and listen to that or watch it on YouTube. But we're going to continue on. But before we start to talk about logging time and, you know, the good, the bad, and the illegal, and what to do and what not to do, and when building time, what to avoid. I did have a question from a listener. I want to address that first before we get started. And one of the viewers, and by the way, if you do have questions, feedback at aviationcareerspodcast.com or just drop it down below. This viewer asked a question, and I think you'd be a perfect person to answer this. Says, what if I lied on my FAA medical application? Chris.
So we get that question quite a bit. What happens if I lie to my medical or if I just made a mistake? If you have incorrectly filled out the form, usually by omitting something, that can be grounds for revocation not only of your medical certificate, but also all of your pilot certificates. So first of all, being honest and filling out the form accurately is really important. The next question, of course, we get is, okay, I've already made the mistake. Can we fix the mistake? And the answer to that is yes, you can always send a correction to the FAA. There is no formal process. There's no form for this. But you can send a letter explaining the situation to the aeromedical division and make sure to include your name, date of birth, and the application number from your medical so that they know which one you are.
Interesting. So as far as having that, there is really no formal process, I guess, as updating, which I was kind of surprised at that. So you basically just, if you say you falsify your records, or I hate to use that word lied, because maybe it wasn't a lie. Maybe it was just like, hey, I thought I could say no, and I did, and I realized I should have said yes. In that case, you know, would the FAA consider that lying on your medical?
So we don't see a lot of distinction between forgetting, lying, or just misunderstanding the questions. And of course, as you know, Carl, the FAA medical form is extremely clear and well explained, and nobody ever makes a mistake on that. No, the form is confusing, and we do see a lot of mistakes and a lot of questions that folks probably should get answered before they fill out the form. So regardless of how the mistake happened, if you realize something has been omitted or not completed correctly, it's generally a good idea to go back and correct that. Technically, there could still be a prosecution for falsifying the information, but what we've seen is that where a pilot goes back and corrects voluntarily, as long as the FAA hasn't discovered the issue on their own, and it's just the pilot telling them, generally the FAA will not do any prosecution for the falsification. They'll just process the information and determine if you're still eligible to have that medical certificate.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's good to know. Well, Chris, let's move into and thanks for that question, by the way, from our viewer. Let's move into the actual topic at hand, the good, the bad, and the illegal as far as logging flight time. I always like to start with the positive, so let's talk a little bit more about the good part of logging flight time. And I know a lot of you have heard me say these things over and over again, but let's kind of review them. For time building, of course, pilot in command in the system is the best type of flight time. What does that mean in the system? That actually means flying in the instrument system, piloting IFR, flying IFR, and actually getting out there and flying in the actual air traffic control system. You could do that as a flight instructor. If you're a double I, file every time you go, but actually in the system, and that's really helps because when you do get to the airlines, of course, I teach at the airlines, and one of the things I do notice is the difference between someone who has been flying in the system or who has never been out there flying IFR. And so it does help a lot when you do that transition over to the airline. So actually PIC time in the system. As far as in addition to that, since things are getting a little bit tighter right now, we're recording this in June of 2024, multi-engine time is becoming a little bit more important. Multi-engine SIC, second in command, or pilot in command, PIC. But most important, it's SIC time. So I really would, PIC time, pilot in command time. But if you can't find any pilot in command time, multi-engine time is multi-engine time. You'll need some multi-engine time for your ATP. And, remember, a year ago, they were talking about, you don't need your ATP. Well, now, especially most of the majors are requiring it, and even some of the regionals. So things have shifted a little bit in the market, and it always will. And remember, the goal, I've always told people, is 1,000 hours PIC turbine, if you can get it. You may wind up being at the majors before that happens. It happens quite often. So multi-engine PIC or SIC is good to have. Also, a great thing to have is flight instruction time. I think flight instruction time is great because you're teaching people how to operate an aircraft and also to really understand a topic. Becoming a flight instructor really teaches you, the instructor, more about that topic. And it's quite amazing how that happens. I would prefer, though, that you get your instrument instructor certificate because with a double I, all those questions that you're asking your students are going to be the same questions that we're going to ask on the actual oral exam for your airline job, or and those technical questions, and or you can actually operate within that system, and that's really something that's really good for you because you've actually been in the system. You know how to file a flight plan. You know when to cancel a flight plan. All those really cool things. So that really correlates. The instrument flying correlates to the airline flying, as opposed to kind of, running around the pattern and doing pattern work, that type of thing. This is a time, I would say, get your double I. It really is helpful. Again, because of the marketplace, many of the instruction jobs that are out there, you definitely will need your double I, especially at some of the bigger schools. When you're working as an independent and you have students to bring in, I get it. It doesn't matter what you have because they're there for you. But if you want to grow your business, the more ratings you have, the better. And that's really, really important. So that's something I really would stress is flight instruction time is really good. Running around the pattern or doing, I get it, doing banner tow is something that builds a lot of time, and that's great. You need total time, but supplement that with something else that's going to help you in the actual world of airline flying. Because as you know, Chris, you don't really get a clearance, do you, when you're picking up a banner, do you?
Not a lot of clearance on that, no.
And the other thing that I usually recommend to people is try to do some cargo flying, but try to do cargo flying with a reputable operator. And Chris, you being an attorney, I know that you've had some clients that have had some challenges in this realm. So this is interesting because, and by the way, I don't ever talk about individual cargo carriers or any other carriers just because on the show like this, if we want to do like a personal kind of counseling session, we can do that through our coaching and we can talk about that there. But there are ones that are better than the others. And I guess I'm sure you would agree with that.
Absolutely. I haven't really researched the market recently, but we know from experience that some of the carriers can be pretty good. great stepping stones, and then some of the others can be more interesting to work for, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, and I kind of was alluding to that. Of course, obviously, we have to proceed carefully when we're talking about these, especially when we're looking at cargo carriers or anything else. That's another thing people ask me is, do you recommend certain flight schools or certain 135 operators? Of course, I do. I just don't do that here because we've gotten a lot of feedback, and I've gotten a lot of feedback from attorneys from certain organizations when I do make comments about them here, actually on the show, and then I have to talk to my friend here, Chris Pezalla, about what I need to do. So I kind of avoid all that angst by only doing that in a private session. So if you want to do that, reach out to me on our coaching. But as far as building time, another good thing to do, and this is something that kind of leads into the good, the bad, and the illegal, is building time with somebody else, another pilot. I'm a big fan of all these time building programs that are out there. And as a matter of fact, yesterday I ran into a pilot here at the FBO, and he actually was bringing a mechanic in to fix another airplane that actually was on the ground here that they were trying to fix. And he said he was time building with another person that's at the flight school. So they were kind of sharing that time in the airplane. So make sure that you also understand when you're actually building time with somebody else, who's logging the time as pilot in command. And it's very nuanced, by the way, and it all depends on who's flying and also what the ratings are with that type of flying. So Chris, as far as, and I guess I could start this off, as far as being careful about logging that flight time, as second in command or as safety pilots say, you got to be careful because one person that's a safety pilot means the other person is going to be under the foggles. But also, there shouldn't be three people logging time in an airplane that only needs one pilot. We have seen that before. But as far as from your experience, have you seen in certain logbook reviews some of these kind of nefarious, sometimes I call them, logbooks where people have really pencil whipped and possibly logged second in command time when they were the person in the back seat?
I haven't seen that particular one, but I've heard stories of that happening. I mean, unless they're yelling at you from behind, maybe that counts, right? Obviously, you should be at the controls, but also, as you point out, if this is an aircraft that would normally be flown with one pilot, a Cessna, Piper, Duchess, something like that, you would expect to have a pilot in command. And then if the pilot in command is under the foggles with a safety pilot, then the safety pilot for that portion with the foggles could log that time. And also, as you mentioned, with flight instructors, normally the instructor logs the time as well. But obviously, somebody in the backseat probably shouldn't be logging that.
So let's talk a little bit about an example of this logging of flight time and some of the operators out there that do this. There are some organizations out there that let you log multi-engine time, PIC, because what they do is they basically hire you to fly with them at a very, very low rate. And they have an instructor in the left seat or in the right seat, doesn't matter, and they're teaching you, and you're logging as actual instruction received, and they're giving you instruction, but you wind up also being somebody who's an observer during that flight. So there's a lot of different operators that do many different types of things, but the most important thing, and this is the advice I give people, and I'd like to hear your feedback on this, is before you even take off, make sure that you know who is going to be the pilot in command and during what portion of that flight. And I think what Chris was alluding to is that if you're going to do leg number one, you're going to do the takeoff and the landing, but you're going to be under the foggles so the other person can actually log pilot in command time. Remember that you're the only one that's going to do that takeoff and that landing. So I'd like to see, kind of hear your viewpoint from a legal standpoint.
Oh, right. Well, I mean, if you're not an instructor and you're working with the foggles, then obviously the safety pilot's not logging the takeoff and landing, unless you've transferred responsibility in flight. That's whatever arrangement you guys want to make. As far as, if you have a flight instructor, of course, that's different. They are going to log that because even though they might not be physically manipulating controls, mentally they're flying that aircraft. They're thinking through. Now, what we have seen, though, is with flight instructors flying with other flight instructors, is that sometimes the FAA expects responsibility from both. We spoke with somebody recently where two flight instructors were involved in an aircraft accident, and the FAA put it on both of their pilot records. And it was in a Cessna, so this is an aircraft normally with one pilot, but they were both involved.
That brings up another really good point, Chris. when you're a flight instructor in an airplane and you're going up flying with somebody else, many times it seems the FAA will view the person with the higher rating or in the higher position, whatever you might want to call it, as being also responsible for that flight. And I'm sure there's been examples of those. I've actually only know of one where people have actually just wanted to be just a passenger and they're a flight instructor and wind up getting involved in an incident, an accident, and they go after their certificate.
Yeah, that's something you have to look at. And that's something I worry about. I'm a fairly high time instructor myself, so when I fly with a friend who's a private pilot or commercial pilot, the reality is if something is not right, I'm going to have to say something. Maybe I don't take the controls from them, but I at least need to try to intervene. Because otherwise, yes, it could be tagged to me. And in the case we recently spoke to, the more experienced one was actually at the controls. But in that case, they ended up going after both because they were both flight instructors. This is also a really good reason to have flight instructor insurance. Even though I don't teach right now, I actually keep my flight instructor insurance current. I pay for it every year so that if I do go and rent a plane or fly with somebody and something happens, yeah, at least I have some level of coverage.
Right, absolutely. And I agree with that. I think everybody should have flight instructor insurance. And I don't instruct a lot. I do for the airline, but that's under different insurance. But when I'm out doing teaching, yeah, it's very important. Errors and omissions, that type of thing also. But that's some good stuff. As far as building that time, I did get a question from a viewer on YouTube and asked this. Do the airlines respect flight time as a safety pilot? I have quite a bit of safety pilot time. I know it's legal PIC time under 6151 Echo and 91109 Bravo Charlie, but I don't want to get looked at differently by a potential employer because I wasn't necessarily the sole manipulator of the controls for every single hour of PIC time. Well, interestingly enough, when you're a flight instructor, you're not the sole manipulator of the controls either, but you are part of that. You are very much engaged in that flight. So that time is, if you're somebody who's very actively engaged in flying, that time actually I feel is very important time, especially as a flight instructor. Now I get it, as a flight instructor you are engaged in actually teaching somebody. But as far as how the airlines look at it, and as far as an employer, if you have built a lot of time doing that under the hood, that type of thing, if the majority of that time is just you working as a safety pilot, I'd say try to build up some other time too. But it sounds like you have and I don't know what the percentage is, but I'm assuming from this question that you built a lot of time, maybe half and half. I definitely wouldn't see that as a bad thing with the airlines because you need total time. And to me, when I'm looking at an applicant at an airline, just for an airline job or a Part 135 job, if they've been doing circles around, the pattern or doing, picking up banners and things like that, that doesn't correlate quite as much to the airline world. Whereas possibly if you're flying, especially in the system with all this time, that actually might even be better for you because you're actually engaged in the flight and you're listening to the air traffic control and actually working with air traffic control, possibly jumping in on the actual the flight. So one of the things I'd recommend is how do you craft your message when you're answering that question when someone's asking you that, who's an interviewer. And that's what we do here, is that at our career coaching, we do our interview prep and we teach people how to craft a message around this question right here, and say, hey, listen, this is what I was doing. I was doing this as a pilot in command. I was safety pilot, but I was also very engaged in the flight. I was actively monitoring what was going on as if I was a flight instructor, even though I wasn't a flight instructor during that flight. So that's a better way to craft that message as opposed to, I just sat there and I looked out the window. But that's really important as far as time is concerned, just to make sure you understand, time is time. It's just that in this order of time, having that actual time where you're the manipulator of the controls, you're someone who's actively involved, is much better. So that's what we have for the good time, as far as flight instruction time. Obviously, multi-engine time, flying in the system, 135 cargo, those kind of things are really good for the transition into the airline world. But there's some things that I think are bad ideas for time building. And to help us a little bit, and that's a big, or a lot, I should say, in this condition, is Chris, as far as charters are concerned. A lot of us don't realize that we possibly might be doing an illegal charter or working for an illegal charter. So Chris, kind of give us a little color as to what would be construed, or what we should look out for as far as illegal charters?
So as far as charter go, I mean, charter is transporting people or property for hire. So if you're, of course, working for a legitimate certified Part 135 charter company, no problem at all. Where we get into trouble is we see Part 91 operators, individual plane owners, or pilots renting planes and taking people or cargo places. That's where we run into the issue.
Gotcha. Interesting. So those, gosh, how do you figure that out? I mean, how do you, when you're looking at this, say, what's a good litmus test, say, when you're looking at something to see if it's illegal or not?
So the main thing I'm going to look at is if the people or cargo that you're moving is not part of the company and its internal business, then that should be a clue. So for instance, if you did camera work and you fly a survey plane, that equipment on board, that's part of the business that you are doing. But if somebody hires your employer to move boxes or equipment somewhere else, then that's going to be on-demand cargo that starts to get into the charter world. And the same with passengers. So we start to see, say, moving people from place to place. Now, of course, we've talked about this before. If a private owner owns a plane and wants to hire a commercial pilot, they can do that as long as it's the owner of the plane going for their own reasons. But let's say somebody buys an airplane, they hire you to be their pilot, and then they say, hey, can you take my friend somewhere today? It's just him. Now we start to move into this illegal charter world where we're transporting other people, third parties, and that's where this starts to become an issue.
So I guess the issue is if it's basically maybe incidental to their business as far as transporting somebody. So I'd like to see a little, because I hear that a lot. I mean, and this actually comes in as a question from somebody. It's actually specific to what you're talking about. Is we talk about this before about falling under the 135, 121 veil as far as what you were saying. But what about specifically the business-owned aircraft flying its associates, but the owner is not on board the aircraft? So, for instance, say you go to a job site and you're the owner of the aircraft, but then you have to go home and you fly back home, and then the pilot comes back and picks up those pilots, and the pilot is not on board that aircraft.
So this is it's going to be very fact specific. But let's say you own a company, the ABC Mining Company, and you're going to fly your employees on your airplane with your pilots. That's perfectly fine. As long as that airplane belongs to the business and this is part of the business. Now, let's say you own the ABC Mining Company, but you also own an airplane that's not part of the company. It's just your personal plane, and you hired a pilot to fly your employees. Now your airplane is actually providing charter to your own company. And a lot of us will look at that and say, oh, well, it's my company. This is all fine. Well, no, actually, it's a technicality that matters. So if you're going to use an aircraft for business purposes, you really should contact an aviation attorney first and make sure that you're doing this correctly so you're not becoming your own Part 135 by accident.
And just to clarify, there's nothing wrong with doing that. It's just doing it properly that's important. And a lot of companies do this where they buy aircraft and they own them outside their business, and they wind up chartering that aircraft back to the company that they own. And there's, it's basically there's a lot involved. There's basically some things like who's in control of the flight, that type of thing, which we could go into a lot of detail, but we won't in this video. Just be careful as far as what we're talking about if you're actually using your personal aircraft to move somebody from point A to point B. But this person specifically had that business-owned aircraft, and this is very specific. Yes, that can be done, but the aircraft was owned by the business, and they're moving people from point A to point B, just like the ABC Mining Company that you talked about. Good distinction there to talk about there. As far as, so a lot of people own airplanes individually, but a lot of people own them in partnerships. So what cautions would you bring to bear with people with partnerships that might become illegal charters?
Well, we want to make sure the partnership, or if it's an LLC or other business entity, we want to make sure that that entity doesn't itself become a charter company. Unless of course it's intentionally becoming a charter company and getting certified. So we've seen this before, particularly where multiple individuals own an aircraft, but some of them are not pilots, and then we find the other pilot members flying them places. And this starts to get very fact specific, but that's where we start to get questionable is when you have non-pilots and pilots mix. Now, let's say you're a pilot and your friend Bob is not a pilot. If the two of you want to buy a plane and go fly together, that's really by itself not a problem. But if you start taking Bob places for him to do business or other things, or take him and his family somewhere, now we're starting to cross into some questionable areas. And I've seen this before, especially where people have, say, a child that's learning to fly or building time, and they want to get into a partnership and have their kid go fly the other non-pilot members around. And again, this starts to get a bit questionable at this point.
How about in instances where you're just, letting someone else fly someone from point A to point B using your airplane, but there's no money exchanged?
There's still a bit of a gray area there because it's still a favor that you're exchanging. So even though there's no monetary value, you're still seeing exchange of a favor, and you've got an individual here who's not splitting the flight time. Now, that's not to say you can't go on vacation with your friend who's not a pilot. Two of you can rent a plane, split the cost, go on vacation. But in that case, you're going for your own benefit too, not just to get them where they are going. So this again is where this is fact specific. We see a lot of issues with this with questionable charter aircraft going into the Bahamas and coming back out, and we see the customs agents now asking a lot of questions of passengers. And in a lot of cases, the passengers don't even realize that they are on a plane that's not a proper charter. They were told that this company can take them there and charge X amount. And we've seen some very strange arrangements. So we saw one operator that would lease the airplane to the people that wanted to go somewhere, and then the pilot would contract to them separately, even though he was an instructor for that flight school. And it's no, that doesn't work. We've also seen companies trying to do the Uber model and saying, well, we just arranged the transportation. The FAA has said very clearly several times that no, that's not going to fly either. So it's great that folks have all these creative ideas, but if you have to get creative to rationalize it, you really need to stop and think, how's this going to look to the FAA, and should I be doing this, and will this even be covered by my insurance?
And also, would there be the possibility of a certificate action? I think that's important too, right?
It is, and we've seen cases where the pilot did not understand what they were doing was illegal. So we saw one case come by where the owner, private plane, belonged to an owner, hired a pilot to fly it, and then he was actually letting his friends use it on other days, and he was charging his friends for it. And so he was essentially selling charter services, and he did not tell the pilot that this was what was going on. The pilot is now getting his certificates revoked by the FAA.
Interesting. Wow. And, honestly, I've seen that come up quite a bit in the past. Looking at some other things that we should think about when we're talking about charter, flight schools, whatever, and this is really important, work for somebody who's reputable. I have worked with so many pilots in the past, and I help out a lot of people with medical and also legal issues, trying to navigate through all that journey within their career. And a flight school that's doing something that's wrong or has aircraft that are not airworthy, you can be the one that gets in trouble. And I have a really good horror story. The school's out of business, but this school said, hey, listen, we have this broken appliance on the aircraft, and that's basically like flying partial panel. You don't need it. It's a good training tool to not have this actual instrument. That's not how the FAA looks at it. And everything has to be working in that aircraft. Obviously, you have MELs and stuff like that, but most little small aircraft don't have MELs. That school, what the FAA did is instead of going after the school, they went after each individual instructor for flying that airplane, basically trying to go after the school because they know the school had really good attorneys. And by doing that, we're able to have some of those actual flight instructors say, yeah, we were pushed into trying to fly this plane. We knew it was illegal, but I was going to get fired. So something to think about. And this is a hard thing to do. Sometimes you really should just walk away, because think about your career well in the future. This certificate action will be on your certificate forever. They could try to get it off, but that could be quite expensive. So if you are flying for somebody, make sure they're reputable. How do you do that? There's a lot of ways. You research, you talk to somebody like myself, a career coach, who can show you how to go dig deeper into some of those charter organizations and some of those other companies. But boy, if someone says to you, hey, listen, just don't tell anybody about this, then it's probably a good idea that you not to do it and stay away. And that is for sure. A couple questions. I know we talked about some good and bad, and there's many other good operators out there. Try to get hooked up with somebody who has a lot of integrity. Another interesting thing that we talked about before, but this right seat flying, Chris, which is not really SIC time. And so there's some really important things to look at there. And we did get a question from somebody who said, well, how, if I'm doing work for a 135, can I actually log the SIC time? And if the airplane doesn't require a second in command under its type certificate? Well, you can do that many different ways if the operation or the insurance requires it. And also, there's one other thing out there, and I'm going to put a link down in the show notes. It's 135.99, where it talks about these professional pilot development programs or pilot development programs that the airline can have in place. I'll give you a good example. Certain airlines like Cape Air or some of the other airlines, they have these programs where they put you in the right seat, and you have to actually operate in the right seat. It's required under that certificate, and it has it under the pilot development program, where you will be logging that as second in command time, and you are the second in command, so that you can get experience, so that you can jump into the left seat as pilot in command. And in that case, you can actually log that time as second in command, like in a 402. And we know that you don't need two pilots for a Cessna 402. So that's one instance of that. So that's something that's really important. But be very specific when asking about the certificate, and look it up, as far as, where are we as far as the charter certificate is concerned, and can I see that? And it's filed with the FAA. People that don't want to offer that up, it might be a hassle for them a little bit. They may not be doing it out of spite, but if they really are hiding it, you might want to start questioning things, and then you start looking around. But Chris, I don't know if you have any examples of this, but under those organizations, those charter organizations, have you ever seen any of them that have said they were you are able to fly SIC, but really you couldn't?
We have. We saw one recently where the operator originally did have a pilot development program and could allow the logging, and then they changed their certificate status. They lost that approval, and they didn't bother to tell their pilots that they were hiring. And so one individual had racked up several hundred hours that are now somewhat questionable because they're not within the program. And he called me up and said, what do I do? And I said, well, you're not using them to apply for an FAA certificate. So the only question is, can you show this to an employer or an insurance company? And I said, what you should do here is separate out that time. And when you go to the interview, say, I was operating with this company. It appears they didn't have this program. So this time I'm showing you this time separately in case you don't feel we can count it. And then if the operator says, well, okay, you don't meet our minimums without that, then at least you've been honest, and they'll probably call you back for another interview. We've seen too many cases where somebody gets hired and they're fired 2 or 3 days later because of something in their background check or their logbook. And now that discharge, that firing goes into their pilot record forever.
Yeah, wow, that's tough. That's where you have to do your research, right? And Chris, is there an easy way to find those certificates out there, those 135s? Are they on the internet somewhere or under the FAA?
The FAA should be able to provide those, but also the operator should be willing to show you their operating specs. That shouldn't be a secret. And you can ask them about their pilot development program. If they really have one, they'll be glad to tell you all about it. If you're getting a vague answer of, oh yeah, we can kind of log the flight time, then that should make you wonder if that's really going to be valid or not.
Yeah, to further to that point, some people I've seen get hired by these organizations that say, "Oh yeah, you can fly in the right seat." And but the one thing, and we're going to pay you to fly in the right seat. The one thing they didn't mention is that you can't log that time while you're flying in the right seat with passengers on the airplane. And I was like, oh boy, now you're spending most of your time basically working as a baggage handler, and you're not able to log that time. But how they keep you on is that they pay you fairly well to actually be part of that flight, which is kind of interesting that they do that. So they have their own personal baggage handler, I call them. But you can log some of that time on the empty legs. But that's not much. I mean, it's very few and far between. So there's some really important things to know here for that person that asked a question on YouTube. It's $35.99 to look at the professional pilot development program. A lot, and 121 operators have this too. So some really good stuff here. And I really think that it's important to really do your research. And Chris, do you have anything else you wanted to mention as far as the good, the bad, and the illegal as far as flight time is concerned, or some general advice?
Well, I mean, the general advice, like you said, is do your research and check with somebody reputable, career coach or an attorney if you're questioning whether this time's legitimate, because you don't want to get a couple hundred hours in before you realize that flight time wasn't worth logging. And if you do log flight time that maybe comes into question later, you're not sure. Again, honesty is the best policy here. If you can separate that out and show a potential employer, or if you're doing a check ride, the FAA, that, hey, this time is separate, then being upfront about it, you can identify whether or not it's a problem.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Chrissy, I appreciate that. We do have one other question that came in a little bit related to this. And this was interesting that it came up during the same conversation. They asked, there's this new Airbus A321 XLR, has an incredible range, like 4,700 miles. And this person asked, do pilots need to go through training now that the new 321 XLR is just starting to fly? There's an airline that's starting to fly it. Well, actually what happens in that case, it's called differences training. And depending on how the FAA approves that training, it could be actually a simulator training event, or it can be an in-class event, or it can be an at-home event where you're doing a school, it could be a Zoom meeting, or it could be slides. It could be a recorded conversation with a quiz at the end. And that's what happens. And that's probably what's going to happen with the XLR in most operators in the U.S., the 321 XLR, where you actually do what's called a differences training. It's true with many different airplanes, and it's a real good idea for the airlines to use that airplane because they don't have to do a full training cycle. Now they just have to do differences training. So hopefully that answers your question there, because that was kind of along the same lines as can I fly as SSIC, and how do the airlines get away with doing that? And that's actually through what they call differences training. By the way, another source I love to use for all this information as far as FAR is concerned, the Cornell, law.cornell.edu. They have all the FARs in there, and I love how they have it formatted. It's easy to click on and move around, so I really highly recommend that. But another part of this, too, is looking at the trends in the industry, and it's kind of what was gleaned out of this whole conversation. What are the airlines and what are the 135 operators, the bigger 135s and fractionals, looking for as far as flying time is concerned? The numbers have gone up. You might need to get your ATP now. You also might need to add more hours. Maybe it's 2,000 hours to your total time. So my advice is to keep moving forward in your career by building time, getting more ratings, and adding to everything that you're doing here as far as your background is concerned and everything. And if you do have questions, obviously, you can contact us at aviationcareerspodcast.com/contact, feedback at aviationcareerspodcast.com. And Chris, if they have some kind of maybe a legal question, where can they reach out to find you?
Best way to find us is stroomerlaw.com. That has our phone numbers and email, as well as the web submission forms. And we do try to get back to folks within 24 hours. So if you have a question, even if it's just a simple question, drop us a message and we'll do our best to answer it.
Yeah, and by the way, if you do we've seen this in the past where people have sent us questions, asking Chris a question, we do forward it on. So if we do get it, we just send it over to Chris, and they're been nice enough to answer that for us. But if you're interested in knowing some more about this industry and also getting updates like on a monthly basis, we started this group coaching type of mentorship program here. And one of the things that we do, it's really just $20 a month, where we get on once a month. It's usually at 8 p.m. Eastern time, and we talk about these things, how things are changing. And we always have a success story. I have an industry update, and then I also talk about a certain topic, and then we move into a question and answer session. That might be helpful for you, or if you want, we can do some individual coaching, and you find that aviationcareerspodcast.com/coaching and find out more about both of those things. And of course, if you want one of those free scholarships guides, aviationcareerspodcast.com/free, and you can come meet us, Chris Pezalla, and all the other people from our sister podcast, the Stuck Mike Avcast, at many of the different air shows. We do have some people going to Air Venture. We have some people going to the Florida International Air Show. So best way to keep informed is get on our email list, and we'll send you the dates on all those things that we're attending, and also we have the group coaching mentorship program. And when these next podcasts come out, you'll know right away. But I think the most important thing you can do for me is this. No matter what, do your research, go online, listen to podcasts, watch YouTube videos, but make sure you take one step every day to move forward in your career. And I know that you can get there sooner than you think, because if you just take one flight today, that's one flight closer to actually your career goal. Well, we'll talk to you next episode. Safe flying out there.